I'll just
Yep.
start with the slides. Okay, so you see my slide? Okay, so as usual, you know, I can't see you, so I cannot really see, looking at your face, whether you understand what I'm saying or not. So I think the rule of the game should be that in case there is something you don't understand, and if you have any type of questions, there is indeed no stupid questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me. You take your phone and you ask me a question, okay? I think that's a better way to do things. Okay, so don't hesitate to interrupt me. I insist on that. So here you have a, let's start with the course Project Finance. So there are some pictures on the screen which give you an idea about the type of project we are going to look at. You know, basically these are large infrastructure projects. It might be a large bridge, as you can see here, or a chemical plant, or a refinery, or a wind farms. All these are, let's say, heavy infrastructures with a lot of money to be invested for a long period of time. So this is typically what project finance is concerned with. Okay, so what are we going to talk about more precisely? Indeed, if we use the expression project finance, we have to know what we're talking about. So I'll give you some definitions, and just to give you more details about what project finance is all about, and also try to see why we use this type of specific financing schemes. You know, in other words, we're going to look at the rationale for project finance. Having done that, then you will understand that a key element in project finance is to be able to have a rather reliable estimates of future cash flows to value the project. And as you'll see, one particularity in project finance is the huge level of gearing. I mean, the huge level of debt equity ratio. And if you want to have a lot of that, then you have to make sure that your project is highly secured. Okay, and that's why the risk analysis for a project is a key element, which we have to focus on. Okay, once we have done that, then we'll have to tackle a particular important topic as far as project finance is concerned, which is contracting. Why? Because in project finance, as you'll see, you have many participants. You know, in big projects, you may have thousands of participants, you know, subcontractors and subcontractors and the like. And all the connections, I mean, all the participants are interrelated through different types of agreements or contracts. Okay, and as we'll see, a contract can be seen as an instrument to transfer risk, which is a very important element in project finance. In other words, we're going to focus on that, contracting and risk transfer. Then we're going to move to the project evaluation. Indeed, the project will be developed only if there is enough, let's say, information to tell us that the project is viable, economically viable, okay? And that concerns the project evaluation. Well, you are normally familiar with evaluation because you have seen that in corporate finance. In other words, you know all the basics, the NPV, internal rate of returns, and the like. But as you'll see, there are some difficulties here that needs to be tackled, and that's why it's worth spending a bit of time on this evaluation issue with particular problems when it comes to large infrastructure projects. And then project financing in itself. So what are the type of instruments? Project finance also corresponds to specific tools which are used to finance the project. For instance, basically we're gonna use what we call no recourse debt, which probably you're not familiar with, which needs to be analyzed in depth. I will also take this opportunity to start talking to you about these famous green bonds, which are very, let's say, famous today. A lot of investors are keen to invest in this type of instruments. Whether it's a good thing or not, I still don't know. I mean, lots of questions around it. But these are the type of issues we are going to discuss in this last chapter. Okay, so here you have the content and the structure of the course. So let's start with a few definitions, just to be a bit more precise about project finance. Well, Project finance, systematically, it refers to rather complex schemes with a lot of contracts. Okay, so project finance refers to complex contractual schemes and also complex financial structures. Because, as you'll see, to finance this type of project, we use a wide range of financial instruments, not just equity and debt. It's much more complex than this. And well, there are many different types of projects. That's why there is no easy or, let's say, general definition of project finance. It's better, rather than defining precisely project finance, well, it's better to give you the characteristics of the project which are financed using this type of approach. First of all, I mentioned that to you already, it mostly concerns long-term capital-intensive projects involving proven technologies. Okay, typically infrastructure project, you know, it might be an airport, it can be an expressway, it can be a power plant, it can be a chemical plant, you know, heavy infrastructures, which mean that you need to invest a lot of capital, you need to raise the huge amount of funds in general for a very long-term project, okay, and sometimes with very specific risks that need to be handled. So the main characteristics of project finance, I would say, is there. Huge amount of capital, very long horizon, and also a rather important risk due to the amount of capital invested in technologies which, as I say here, normally are proven technologies, but also sometimes they are proven, but very difficult to implement and to develop. So there is a kind of technological risk also being part of the game. Another point is the structure that is put in place when you use project finance to finance a project. Well, the project actually is segregated. For that, we launch a special purpose vehicle, SPV. You are probably familiar with this expression. You know? So that's why we say that funds are provided for a ring-fence project. The project is isolated. Why do we do so? Because we want to isolate the cash flows and also control the cash flows within this special vehicle. There are sponsors involved, indeed, because if you launch a special purpose vehicle that is a kind of, rather than SPV, I will also use the expression project company. Okay, well, if you have a project company which is, let's say, launched specifically for developing this project, well, you need to have equity holders. They would bring the equity part, and rather than shareholders, we'll use the word sponsors. And usually you don't have just one shareholder, you have many sponsors, many shareholders, which usually are companies with certain know-how in the technology which is going to be developed through the project. Okay, so there are several sponsors, and since they are joining their efforts to develop the project because they have the know-how, they have an interest in developing that project, they will come together and build an alliance through a shareholders agreement usually. Okay, so that's the second point, which is very important. You know, few investors, the sponsors, bringing equity to a specific vehicle which is launched for the development of the project. Well, what's next? When it comes to the equity contribution of sponsors, well, one of the main characteristics of project finance is that the equity share is very low in comparison with what you would see for any other company. And as I mentioned here, you know, the equity contribution of sponsors is limited, lenders providing most of the funds needed. And within brackets here, I note up to 80%. I just maintain it, but you know, it's now more like a dream, because 80% is no longer exactly what can be done. It's more like 60 or 70 today. But up to 2008, just before the financial crisis, you know, it was rather frequent to see an equity contribution of 20% only with 80% of debt. Okay, so you see that it means that the debt equity ratio is huge. If you take 80% of debt, in other words, it means that you have a gearing of 4. Okay, and it's also the interesting point is if you look at the kind of debt which is used, it is a debt which is qualified of limited recourse, of no recourse debt. In other words, okay, the lenders are providing the funds, but they have very little guarantee on the assets. Why is it so? You know, if the main assets of the companies are an expressway or a bridge or an airport, well, it's difficult to get that as a guarantee. I mean, you know, it's not something you can just take like this and sell. Try to sell an expressway, you'll see that it's a bit tricky. Okay, so in other words, the assets cannot really constitute a guarantee for the lenders. So where is the guarantee? The guarantee is essentially in the potential cash flows generated by the project, okay, to cover the debt service. So how is that feasible to bring 80% of the funds needed for the project as debt with such a little guarantee, you know, because it's only on cash flows? The only solution is to make sure that the future cash flows will be highly secured, as I said. Okay? In other words, since the cash flows, that's a very strong point you need to keep in mind from the very beginning. Since the cash flows constitute the major guarantee for the lenders, okay, for the credit risk, okay, well, you can understand that the cash flows have to be highly secured. And all the system which is put in place is geared toward reducing the risk, you know, affecting future cash flows. So to secure future cash flows, how can we do that? Well, the risks are allocated to the project participants. I told you there are many, each with a specific expertise. If each has a specific expertise, it also means that each participant has a certain capacity to control certain type of risk. They are experts in the field, okay? And this allocation of risk to the different participants will reduce the risk of the final cash flow generated by the project company. And that's the way you can get this high level of debt, by securing the cash flows, because the most of the risk, as we'll see, through contracting, okay, with the involving many participants in the deal, okay, well, the risk can be, let's say, taken out of the project company and transferred through contracting to the many participants, okay? For this reason, a large number of stakeholders are normally involved through various types of agreements and contracts being tools to transfer the risk outside of the box, outside of the SPV or the project company. Okay, so here you have about, if not a definition, at least the main characteristics of project finance. First, I remind you, usually projects which are capital intensive with a longer horizon, and some technological risk. Well, the risk is a key problem. That's why you need a careful risk analysis, and also you need to find a way to allocate the risk to the many participants that will join and participate in the program through all types of contract. And if you are able to do that, then lenders, because the cash flow would be highly secured, would accept to come in the project with no or limited recourse. Okay? Well, so to be a bit more clear about it, let's look at this slide now, which was a kind of description of how a project works. So we start by launching a special purpose vehicle, as I said, you know, SPV, which is a project company, which is where all the assets will be located. You know, it's the company which will be in charge of developing the project. Who are the sponsors? Private sponsors. Okay, with shareholders agreement. Who are they? Usually they are companies which have a know-how in the field and expertise. Okay, they have also proven their capacity to develop similar projects, which will reassure the investors, because if they have built their reputation, if they have built a strong expertise in the field, investors will feel that it is less risky than it would be with companies with little experience in the field. Okay, and the sponsors are usually companies which are interested in the development of the project, because that's an opportunity for them to sell their services and to provide their technology. Okay, so that's for the equity funds. Now you have loans up to 80%. To be more realistic today, we should say something like around 60-70%. Okay, it's not usually one bank which is providing this amount of money, okay, but a pool of banks. Okay, a pool of banks, sometimes we say a syndicate of banks, okay? And we'll see later on that within these banks you have the arrangers. Arrangers, they will contribute to the, let's say, financial engineering of the project finance scheme. Providers would be more focused on just providing the money, okay? But indeed, arrangers can also be providers, okay? So here we are. Well, but now, as I said, this is feasible only if you have been able to reduce the risk within the project company. How can it be done? Through contracting, which is a way to involve many other participants. For instance, if you take the case of it can be a chemical plant, it can be whatever you want, a power plant. Well, you may need raw materials. If it's a gas power plant, you will need gas. So you need to make sure that you will have the quantity of gas you need. For instance, if you take a gas power plant, and make sure you will have the quantity you need, and you also have a problem, which is the volatility of the price of gas. Okay, so how can you fix it? Well, there are some specific agreements with suppliers that can be put in place so that you will kind of guarantee the quantity you need for the activity of the project, as well as stabilizing the prices through all types of possibility of contracts, okay, within a supply agreement. So the supply agreement will be one way to control the supply risk that would come from the fact that you might be short of supply, or you also have this problem of the volatility of the cost of supply. And all that would be handled in the supply agreement. We'll see later on through example how this can be done. Okay, on the other side, well, you have to sell what you produce. Well, again, you have buyers, and you can have a specific agreement with the buyers. The buyers being committed, for instance, to buy what you produce. That would typically be the case for a power plant. Okay, you produce electricity. Usually, you have a national company buying the grid, as we call it, would buy the electricity which is produced systematically. Okay, and cover some fixed cost when electricity is not needed, and they would guarantee a price for the electricity they buy. So you see, through this sales agreement, you kind of reduce dramatically, cancel out to a certain extent the commercial risk. What else? Well, one of the important risks for projects, particularly for heavy infrastructures, is the construction risk, with the risk of delays, cost overrun, which might be a problem for the risk. Again, you have different types of contracts which can be developed and signed with contractors. For instance, typically you have EPC contract, engineering, procurement, and construction contracts, that will stipulate the conditions under which the construction will take place, and what is the share of the risk which is taken by the contractors. You see, after all, the contractors, they are specialists in construction, don't they? If they are specialists in construction, it means they are in a better position to take the construction risk. Okay? In other words, you see, the construction risk, most of it can be transferred out to the contractors. And they would accept to take it because they feel it's fair enough to take this risk because that is their job. Okay? So by doing so, you can, through an EPC contract, have most of the construction risk outsourced out of the special purpose vehicle, which will again contribute to secure the, let's say, economic performance of the project. Well, indeed, constructors cannot take all the risk. You know, you have some risks which are totally out of control. You may have an explosion, you may have an earthquake, whatever you. Well, so you can use insurance. Insurance contracts are there also to cover some risk for which there is no specific entity or partner within the project that could accept the risk. So insurers will also contribute to reduce the risk exposure of the SPV. What else? Well, the host government. You know, when you develop infrastructure, most of the time the public entity is involved because these infrastructures are mostly public infrastructures. Okay, so the host government, for instance, will provide some guarantee to secure the activity, property rights to start with, okay, a regulation that would stabilize the business, the conditions under which you operate, permits, which allow you to develop the project, concession, which will also give you a time period during which you can operate, and which will just guarantee guarantee the investors that you will have the right to operate under certain conditions which are fixed today for a period of time which is long enough for the project to generate the cash flows needed to cover the debt. So you see the host governments here provide a guarantee. Indeed, if the infrastructure is developed within, let's say, an emerging country where you have a, let's say, a kind of political risk, okay? Well, it wouldn't be the case of Vietnam, which is seen as relatively stable politically. Well, but there are countries where, you know, the situation, the political situation is not that stable. Just look around you, okay? And in this case, well, can we really count on the guarantees of the government? You know, maybe a new government will come in a few months and they will change everything. So in this case, you can use insurance because they have political insurance, okay? You can also count on international organizations such as the World Bank or what we call ECAs, which stands for Export Credit Agencies. They might also provide some solutions for this political risk, okay? These organizations, ECAs, such as the French company COFAS, for instance, or maybe you've heard of Euler Hermes providing all types of analysis on country risk and guarantees for this type of country risk. Well, these organizations, they can provide loans, the World Bank in particular, which is a major international organization involved in the project financing of emerging countries. And they would provide loans, but and also credit enhancements. I don't know to which extent you are familiar with this concept of credit enhancement. It means that if you have, for instance, a credit insurance from, let's say, an ECA like COFAS, it means that it will improve the quality of the debt for the banks, because the banks know that in case of default, well, the credit insurance will come there to compensate the loss. Okay, so it does improve the quality of the debt. That's why we use the expression credit enhancement. More specifically, for instance, if you to start with, if the debt is rated BB, okay, by Standard & Poor's or Moody's, okay, well, thanks to the credit enhancements, this BB, because of the guarantee provided by the credit insurance, the BB might move up to something like, let's say, AA, okay, and you know, here it means that banks will be, I would say, more keen to accept to lend. And also, that is important, they will accept to lend if it's AA rather than BB with a lower spread. In other words, a lower cost of debt. Okay, so what else? Well, the concept of escrow account is you find it very often in projects when you have international investors. Let's take the case of Vietnam. You will perfectly understand. Let's assume that the project would be a heavy chemical plant with the idea not just to provide Vietnamese customers, but also to provide other customers in the region with payment in dollars. Okay? So the part of the cash flows generated by the project company will be in dollars. Are you going to repatriate all the dollars back to Vietnam? Well, investors may not like it so much. Why? Because you know that it might be sometimes difficult to take the money out of your country. For any reason, you can have some bureaucrats saying, well, no, we don't agree with the transfer of money out of the country, or no, even if you can do it at the end, you may have delays and so on. And investors are not comfortable with that. So in this case, let's assume you have the project located in Vietnam, okay? And you have cash flows from outside in dollars. Well, in this case, rather than sending the cash flows directly to Vietnam, you will send it to a foreign account, which we call an escrow account, which might be located in Singapore. Okay, so the money would come directly to Singapore rather than coming to Vietnam. So when it comes to payment of the debt service, well, it can be paid directly from Singapore without going through Vietnam, so that it will reassure the lenders. Okay, that's why escrow accounts are very often used, particularly when you have cash flows which are generated from a part of the world which is outside the country where the project is developed. Okay, what else? Well, you can also have lease contract. In this case, very often used when you have some equipment that can be taken as a guarantee. Actually, it's very much used, for instance, for the airline companies. The airline companies usually they don't own their aircraft; they lease their aircraft, and there are special lease contracts, and it's part of a very specific aspect of project finance. But the interest here is that, as you know, the lessor is the owner of the equipment. So if the project company defaults, well, there is a guarantee for the lessor because he owns the equipment and he can take the equipment back. That's the reason why it is often used for aircraft, because if the company is failing, if the airline company is going bankrupt, well, the lessor can take the aircraft back and then later on lease it to another company looking for an additional aircraft. Okay, so you see, this is a kind of simple description, but in real life, you have much more. Here you have few, maybe 10 or 12 participants, but in fact, you have much more than this. First of all, the banks might be 20, 30, sponsors can be 3, 4, 5. But when you look at constructors, suppliers, this graph doesn't show all the subcontractors and sub-suppliers. So if you include these, all these sub-suppliers and subcontractors, okay, then you may have hundreds of participants within a project. That's also where the complexity comes from. And that's why, as I said, we will have to discuss this issue of contracting. Contracting is a major weakness in project finance today. Okay? Why? Because contracts are not quite always easy to design and to manage once they have been designed. Okay? So I hope that at this stage you have a kind of at least vague idea of what project finance is all about. So let's look at a few numbers now. Okay. Well, just a remark. You don't have this slide on your document because these are very recent slides which I found to update the course. Okay. I will make sure that you have these slides as soon as tomorrow. Okay. Well, these are numbers. The slide you have, it stopped in 2019, and I have updated with 220 numbers here. This graph is also more, let's say, easy to read, to look at, to analyze than the slides you have. Okay, but if you look at this, well, you would see that we had a peak in 2019 with something above $300 billion as project finance loans. Okay. Project finance loans, if you assume that on average, the loans represent 70% of the total project cost, you see that altogether it would correspond to project finance for about $350 billion. And you have the repartition here depending on the region. You are concerned with Asia Pacific and Japan, and as you can see, it's the orange block, which is not the biggest indeed, but which is growing. Okay, well, global project finance loans by sector here on this new graph for the year 2020. What you can observe, and it's not surprising considering the challenge that it represents today. Well, most of the projects are in the energy domain. If you look at power, 133 billion nearly, and for the oil and gas, it's around 64. So altogether, the total being 277. The energy industry represents more than 2/3 of the funds invested using project finance schemes. Okay, and as we'll see, I will take a few examples in Vietnam. Most of the examples in Vietnam corresponds also to this aspect, with a lot invested in power generation. So what about the regions? You have here the different blocks. If you look at global, the Americas, well, it includes North America. So you see that North America is a big contributor to the total amount, 67 billion. Okay. if you look at the EMEA, which include Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia, you see we have something like 43, okay? Middle East and Africa, all these countries are, let's say, developing countries, and that they desperately need new infrastructures, which explains why you have a rather high number here. Europe is a bit less. Why? Because in Europe we already have a lot of infrastructures, and but again we use that more and more to finance power generation projects. Okay, when it comes to Asia Pacific and Japan, you see that Australasia is high. Why? Because it includes Australia, and Australia has a lot of mining projects. And mining project finance is also very much used for that. Southeast Asia is rather small. You see South Asia also. So you see Asia is not that well represented if you compare with other countries. If you look at it, it's a rather small portion of the total. Let's look at Vietnam more precisely. You see, here you have Vietnam. Vietnam is kind of lagging behind, as you can see, with an amount which is rather small, less than 1 billion altogether. And but would you have looked at the number of last year? It was even lower than this. So it is a growing concern. I mean, the capacity to develop project finance in Vietnam is a growing concern today, and there are more and more projects which are being or about to be financed using this type of financial structure. Okay. When you look at Singapore, you have a lot of projects there, but it's maybe just because the location is Singapore, the special purpose vehicle is there, but sometimes the project is taking place somewhere else. Okay. Well, so here these are about the same data, which I didn't want to take out. But you find the same ideas. When you look at the main domains concerned, you see it's capital-intensive project, proven technologies. Why do I say proven technology? Just a comment on this. If a technology is not proven, it means it is risky. And remember what we said. You have to make sure that cash flows are highly secured. If you use a technology which is not proven, okay, well then it's too risky, and project finance will not be used. Okay, so you really need to make sure that those who are developing the project have an expertise, and that to a certain extent the technology is proven, meaning that it has been developed already, there is a good control of it, and therefore most of the technological risk is, let's say, reduced. Okay, and also these investments, the third point, you always consider a long-term perspective. You find again that power represents a dominant share of it. Transportation also, indeed. Well, Asia Pacific and Japan, you have roughly the same repartition by industry. Okay, so I skip this one. Well, so an up-to-date topic in Vietnam. Well, I just saw that it's in May 2021. You see, Legan Wind Power Development Corporation. I don't know if you've heard of it, but this is a case which I will look at more precisely in a minute to take a Vietnamese example. Okay, I will develop a European example with more detail, just because even though this Legan Wind Power is quite interesting in Vietnam, it is starting only so that we don't have all the results. And therefore, I will just have an introduction of this case to describe it to you, just because as Vietnamese, I thought it was better for you to have a kind of Vietnamese example rather than just European or examples coming from other locations. So now, what is rational for project finance? Before we move to the example I have mentioned. For sponsoring companies, first. In other words, for companies which are going to invest as shareholders in the project company. Okay? I remind you, we are using the word either sponsor or shareholder of the SPV in this course. Okay? So I can just mention this point to start with, because I know that you are familiar with Miller and Modigliani, which you probably have heard of in corporate finance. And I'm pretty sure that you remember the rule that Modigliani and Miller have kind of established. Well, they say that, in fact, the capital structure has no influence on the value generated by the company. Okay? In other words, in this case, why should we use project finance? In other words, complex financial schemes, if, following Miller and Modigliani, if it doesn't create value. Okay? Because the capital structure has no influence on the performance of the operations. Okay, that's basically the idea of M&M, as we call them. Okay? But, however, you know that the conclusion by Modigliani and Miller is changed if you integrate tax in the analysis, okay? Because tax saving might be an incentive, and we'll see that tax saving can clearly be a source of value in project finance, okay? So that's the first point. But it's used in the past. There was a strong argument, which was that by doing so, companies were developing projects in a special purpose vehicle, isolated from the company, which was not necessarily consolidated in the corporate accounts. Okay? There was a kind of off-balance sheet accounting for the asset held in an SPV in project finance. It is indeed no longer a strong argument today. Why? Because you know that the accounting rules have changed. You've heard of CSB accounting rules, okay? And now, strictly speaking, if you follow the rules which apply today in accounting, in international accounting, you know, if you have a significant partnership in the SPV, then you will have to show your liabilities in this SPV also in your balance sheet. So the off-balance sheet accounting is no longer a relevant argument, even though it used to be an argument in the past. You know, when I say in the past, I mean before the year 2000, after a series of scandals on the stock exchange where companies were taking risk here and there without showing this risk in their balance sheet. Now I would say that, and you know, that it's no longer easy to do so. Well, but the motivations, you know, are mostly and mainly today organizational. What does it mean? Well, segregating the project has a clear advantage. If you develop the project, for instance, let's say you have let's say PetroVietnam, a Vietnamese company, okay? Well, if PetroVietnam wants to build a new, let's say, a power plant, okay? A new power plant, a wind farm, if you like, to produce electricity. Let's assume it is part of PetroVietnam. It's not isolated within an SPV, it's part of PetroVietnam. It means that the assets are part of the asset within the balance sheet of PetroVietnam, okay? It means that the cash flows generated by the power plant, the new power plant, will contribute to the general cash flow of PetroVietnam. And you see, in this case, it may be very difficult to identify the performance of this new project, okay? Why? Because you have different costs which are not easy to allocate either to the project or to the rest of the company. You don't know whether a person who is working only part of his time for the project, whether he should be paid by another service. So you see, it's very difficult to identify the performance, to follow the responsibilities also, and to control the performance of the project you develop. That's why segregating the project in a special purpose vehicle, in a project company, particularly when you have a high level of debt, it helps identifying responsibilities and it helps controlling performance also. Okay? So that's a way to deal with the so-called agency issue. The agency issue is, okay, you invest, but you don't have much control on the experts who are running the company. Okay? And therefore, if you have a special purpose vehicle, well, all the cash flows, everything that relates specifically to the project, all that is highlighted within the company. So you will see the accounts, you will see the flows, the cash flows, you will see the costs and so on. which are specifically attached to this project. So it is a way to reduce the agency issue. Dealing with information asymmetry and risk allocation. Okay. Risk allocation is a particularly important point here, because if you want to have a high level of debt, as we said, you need to reduce the risk. Okay. If you have this SPV, you may build a kind of joint interest among all stakeholders. And as we said, you can share the risk and allocate the risk to the different participants depending on the type of risk they are familiar with. Okay, if they are experts in a particular domain, as we said already, then it is fair enough to ask this entity to take the risk for which they have a kind of expertise in. Okay, so by doing so, you optimize the risk allocation. Okay, and you reduce inefficiencies. Okay, so that's this joint interest among the stakeholders, because usually all the stakeholders have an interest in the success of the project. Okay, well, this joint interest can be, let's say, taken into account to optimize the structure and to optimize the risk allocation, which will be done in better conditions. Protecting sponsors' assets. Well, it is true that the risk exposure for the sponsors is limited to their equity stake in the SPV, and the cost of default is also reduced. Why? Because, as we'll see later on, the lenders have a no-recourse debt. They accept that the only guarantee or the main guarantee they're going to have comes from the cash flows of the project. They are not going to look at the different sponsors to go further than the equity they have invested in the special purpose vehicle. Okay? Well, so that's also a good point for sponsors. They know that they risk their equity, but they also know that because of the type of financing which is used, they will not lose more than the equity they have accepted to invest in the project company. Well, now we can see the interest for sponsors and for equity holders to use this project finance approach. But what about governments? Okay, because as I said, most of the projects are infrastructure projects, and as such, governments are the public entities. There is always a public entity involved. That's why we'll discuss the concept of PPP in a minute, which stands for public-private partnerships. You know, most of these project finance for infrastructure needs are developed as part of a PPP project. So for governments, what is their position? First of all, and it's typically the case for a country like Vietnam, you are developing very fast. Okay, I don't know what your growth rate was in 2020, but probably in the range of 5 to 6%, because 2020 was not a good year. Okay, but when you grow at 6, 7%, well, there is a point where you absolutely need to improve your infrastructure. For instance, you could dream of having a fast train between Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, okay, which is not quite the case today. Maybe the road infrastructure also could be improved in your country. So you see, what I mean is, when you reach a certain stage of your development process, there is an absolute need to develop your infrastructures. On the other hand, to develop infrastructures, you need money. If these are public infrastructures, you can expect that the public sector will be able to finance part of it, okay? But for the public sector to be able to finance, well, the public sector has to raise tax. And you guys, you know, paying tax is not quite, you know, always quite well accepted in countries like yours, because in the early phase, you know, of development, you are not in the early phase, but you're still at a level where, you know, taxation is not yet developed enough to provide the state with all the money needed for this huge amount of funds needed to develop your infrastructures. Okay, here you can see that project finance and PPP in particular can be a solution, because you will use private funds to develop public infrastructures. Okay, and therefore this use of private funds will be a way to limit public deficits. There is a shortage of public money due to the large amount of funds needed for infrastructure development. Of course, we could have a discussion about the concept of public deficit, because normally you have to make sure also that part of the risk is also taken by the private investors. Okay. Otherwise, if the public entity is taking all the risk, then it means that it is similar to having a debt. You know, it would be a kind of contingent liability. So that's the first point. A way to use private funds, which is indeed a major reason for using project finance. But also, if you develop an infrastructure, let's say, only at the through a public entity, well, there are discussions about what is the best project to develop, because there are many projects that can be developed, and you have to choose to give priorities. And usually, when there are discussions, you have a lot of political interference, some local lobbying issues, and so on, so that the cost of capital will not explicitly be taken into account. And if you want to have a rational strategy in terms of defining priorities for infrastructure, it's also good to see where do you create value for money. If you have a limited amount of money available, a limited capacity to invest in infrastructure, you should make sure that you are investing the money where it's really priority, where you have the best return on that money. And when I say return, I mean a return. We'll see that with more detail later on, with the public meaning of it. Okay, so by taking explicitly into account the cost of capital, which is the case if you use project finance with private investors, then it's a way to improve the rationality of the decision process. More efficiency is expected. I don't want to comment this too much, but it is something which is usually mentioned. There is the idea that if you involve private entities in the development of the project, it will be more efficient. I'll let you decide here, because implicitly it is behind you have the idea that the public sector is not efficient. So I'll let you decide and decide what you want to think about it. Okay, but that's a reason for, let's say, an argument in favor of project finance, which you would find in the literature in general. Okay, particularly because it will tend to reduce investment expenditures, because the private entities intervening in the project are specialists in the field, and also those who are operating the project later on once it is completed. These are specialists, and they also are good at operating and therefore at reducing operating costs. Well, project finance, if you remember well, you have a high level of debt, which is a key element to take into consideration for the discussion. Okay. In other words, there is a high financial leverage. I don't need to explain what the financial leverage is. I can assume that you have seen that in corporate finance, and you know that if you borrow at, let's say, money at 5%, and if you invest in a project that produces 10% return on capital employed, then you benefit from a financial leverage because the cost of funds is lower than the return on capital employed. Okay, and therefore you improve the performance of your project because you have higher debt. You improve the return for the shareholders because you have a high level of debt with a debt which is cheaper than a cost of which is lower than the return, the economic return on the project. In this case, what does it mean? It means that the leverage would increase, would contribute to increase the return for equity holders. Okay, but since the project is safe for all the reasons we have mentioned, because this optimal risk allocation and the fact that banks are have a no-recourse debt and so on. Okay, well then equity holders would normally accept a reasonable return. Okay, and therefore, if you have a reasonable return for equity holders, it means that the funds will be cheaper altogether, thanks to the state guarantees in particular, okay, and the optimal allocation of risk. If the cost of funds is lower, then the required profitability for can be lower. And if the required profitability is lower, what does it mean? It means that if you provide a service, for instance, if you provide electricity, if you use project finance to develop a power plant, okay? Well, because of the safety net which are there, okay? And the high return that will provide shareholders with a good return on equity, okay? Because of this high financial leverage. Well, you will need a very high profitability to cover all this, the cost of debt as well as the cost of equity, okay? If you have a low required profitability, it means you don't need to charge a high price for electricity. In other words, with a high leverage, it may lead to a low price for the offtake contracts. An offtake contract, when it comes to electricity, for instance, would be the contracts which indicate at which price you will buy the electricity to sell it back to your population. Okay, so it's a way, because this project finance approach contributes to reduce the risk and reduce, therefore, the cost of funds. Okay, and also reduce the required profitability of the project considering the high level of gearing. Okay, then you can charge lower price for the service, for the public service you provide. And your population will be happy with that indeed. Well, and typically for a country like Vietnam also, project finance is obviously a source of technology transfer. You will attract foreign investors who are specialists in the field. Okay, they will come with their technology, they will recruit some of your people, they will train some of your people. Okay, and it's a great opportunity to transfer technology so that later on you can develop your own know-how and your own expertise. And indeed, it will contribute to boost infrastructure development, to accelerate it, and it will contribute to the economic development in general. So there are lots of side effects in terms of technology transfer and more services for the population that is indeed highly beneficial. Okay, so again, you can conclude that governments have a strong interest in using project finance, and it explains why it becomes more and more popular, particularly in a country like yours in Vietnam. Okay, well, as far as Vietnam is concerned, it's no longer so much a concern today, but it used to be. It has also been used as a tool for privatization. Okay, I think that most companies which were public companies and which could be privatized have been privatized already, but I just mentioned it for you that this type of scheme has been used in the past for privatization, okay, through PPPs. I've mentioned the concept of PPP, so let's be a bit more precise on this. So it stands, I remind you, for a public-private partnership. Yes, just a remark, PPP is also used in other courses for purchasing power parity. So it's totally different, nothing to do with that, It's here, we're talking of public-private partnership. Okay. So there are different forms of public-private partnership. Here, I show you a graph which comes from, you have the reference here, and it's a document from the World Bank, which shows the different types of partnerships that may exist. If you're on the left side, in the pink area, well, you see there is a very low involvement of the private entity. The private entity would just provide a service to the public entity which own and operate the assets, okay? Then when you move to the right, well, you start with a public-private partnership when you have, for instance, a management contract or an operating contract. In this case, the public entity would still own the assets, but would ask a private entity to get involved in the operations, okay? And then you can, move to the right progressively to concessions, BOT. BOT stands for build, operate, transfer. And in this case, you reach a situation where the private entity would invest, would bring the money in, okay, would manage and so on. And usually after a certain period of time, you have a transfer of the assets to the public entity. Okay. What is DBOs? DBO stands for design, build, and operate. Okay, then the private sector will just design, build the infrastructure, and operate. Okay, without owning in this case. BOT, I would say there is a higher still involvement of the private partnership, because the private sector will build, operate, and transfer later on. And as long as the transfer date has not been reached, well, the assets are owned by the private investors. Okay. And at the end, if the private sector decide to just withdraw fully from the entity, in this case, well, you have full divestiture and it's purely private activity. So here you have the different type of involvement of the private and the public sector that can be observed. Okay, the most common are BOTs and concessions. Well, PPPs are very much used today, and typically in countries like yours. Nevertheless, it looks fine. You can see that there are lots of interest of using this type of approach to develop infrastructures, but there are also lots of problems. Why? And most of the problems, to be clear, comes from the public entity. The first weakness is poor preparation. You can always say, well, let's go for a PPP. That's great. That's the way to go. Yeah, but you have to be prepared. If there is no expertise about PPPs in the public sector, well, that's a problem, because nobody will be able to work with the private entity, the private investors, the private partners. Okay, and the project will be poorly prepared, so that the private partners will have difficulties to get the information they need to talk to their partners within the public sector, and it will end up with a very poor preparation of the project development, which is a major cause of misunderstanding and failure. Well, I want to insist on that point, because I don't know if some of you have thought of it, but it's great. I think it's a great opportunity in a country like yours to become a specialist in that. Okay, because you can contribute a lot to develop this needed expertise in a country like yours, where the need for infrastructure is huge. Lack of clarity about project objectives. Okay, you want to develop a project for this or this, but what are your objectives exactly? What do you want? What types of service you want to deliver to your people? Okay, you want an expressway. Well, are you sure you need that? And what type of equipment do you need? What type of airports you need, for instance? Okay. What type of energy do you need, and what type of control do you want to have on the project, and so on and so on. So it has to do with poor preparation to a certain extent, but very often, because there might have also some political interferences, you may have a lack of clarity about the project of the objectives, and again, that's a problem that appears particularly on the public side. Too much focus on the transaction and not enough on the fundamentals of the project. Too much focus on the transaction, we mean that, well, you want to discuss all the contracts and so on, and that's again a lack of preparation it's correlated, it's linked to the poor preparation and the lack of expertise on the public side, and therefore they just focus on the contracts to make sure that the public party will not be cheated and so on, and they are not enough focusing on the fundamentals of the project. What counts first is not so much the content of the contract, all the details. Of course it is important, but you cannot do that unless you have a clear view on the fundamentals of the project, which should be the focus. That's where the focus should be placed. Inappropriate risk model applied to the project. Well, as I told you, risk analysis is a key element. Well, you need to make sure that you have a proper risk analysis. There are, for each domain, some ready-made risk models, but you have to be careful with that, And there are many cases where the failure comes from the fact that you had a kind of weakness in the risk analysis due to a model which was applied and which was not a proper risk model. Failure to realize value for money. Well, in the end, maybe because the project is not working as well as it should. Okay, maybe because there are difficulties to recruit local people as it is planned. For instance, the project, if there is a lack of, let's say, know-how locally and so on, not enough training done and so on. So in the end, the project will not produce what was expected from it. Lack of internal capacity. It's a bit the same of what I said before. You need to train your people. You need to make sure you have the capacity to develop and to be part of the project. Okay, or in this case, it's better to count fully on the private entities to make sure that the project will go well. Okay, well, all these elements are taken from a paper which is mentioned here if you want to know more about it. Closing the Infrastructure Gap, which was a report developed by Deloitte, which has done a lot in the field of PPPs. Okay, so you can go on the website and you will find all the details with comments, further comments on these elements which I have mentioned. Okay, so just to summarize, PPPs constitute a very relevant approach, but it's kind of tricky. And if you look at it a bit, you will see that there have been a lot of failures in the past. But indeed, there is more and more experience. The World Bank also would provide a lot of recommendation, also some support, some help to limit, the negative impact of all these weaknesses. Well, so where is Vietnam in the what is called here the PPP maturity curve? You see the S-shaped curve here, which indicates, if you look at the horizontal axis, it's a level of activity as far as PPP is concerned. It means not only the number of PPPs, but the amount invested through PPPs. And you have the level of sophistication. If you are on the top, on the vertical axis, it means you are looking at sophisticated, very complex type of public-private partnerships, okay? And you have a curve like this, meaning that usually countries will start at the lowest level with a small activity in very simple type of cases with more complexity in the end and more activity, okay? So you have different countries which are positioned here, okay? With Australia and UK. Why UK? Because the City of London, you have all type of specialists there, which are sophisticated specialists, I may say, to develop these complex PPPs with the highest level of sophistication. Well, it's in UK now. It's probably going to be in Europe now, because you know that UK has decided to get out of Europe, and a lot of specialists are moving to Amsterdam or Berlin or Paris. So maybe it will contribute to boost European countries such as France and Netherlands or Germany, to be major participants, because a lot of experts are moving away from UK. Well, so where is Vietnam? Vietnam, you see, if you want to put it on the map, you see, Vietnam is around there in terms of development. So you are at the very beginning of the process, okay? And so that's why it's important. I think a course like this one is important for you now. And if you look at this graph, it gives you another kind of picture. It's a comparison of correlation, I should say, between country competitiveness and infrastructure development, okay? You know that the World Economic Forum, WEF, has an indicator of the quality of overall infrastructure per country, okay? You see on this map that, for instance, the Russian Federation has a very low index, meaning, or India also, meaning that the infrastructures are poorly developed here. And if you look at Switzerland, for instance, or Germany, Finland, France, even, France is European country in general are on the extreme right, meaning that you have the highest index score for infrastructures, okay? So where is Vietnam today? The value for Vietnam in 2018, when this graph was, well, it's 3.8. So 3.8, you see, you are really at the bottom here. And since, you know, there is this correlation, it clearly showed that developing infrastructure for Vietnam now is a key element, a key important point to develop its competitiveness. Without developing your infrastructure, you will not be able to move up in the development pattern. Okay? So it's a really important topic for you. So let's take some examples from Vietnam. First of all, a case which I'm not going to consider as a success story, but let's mention it to give you a few Vietnamese examples. And then I will focus more with, because we have a lot of detail, on a European project, which is now completed so that we can look at the whole story of it, okay? The first project finance case, which I found in Vietnam, there are others, but I don't know how to pronounce it, the Nhi Son Refinery and Petrochemicals, NSRP, okay? It's a joint venture company established in April 2008 with Vietnam Oil and Gas Group PVN, okay? Other sponsors, you see, you have the list of sponsors here. One Vietnamese sponsors, which was PVN, which you know probably, but also the Kuwait Petroleum Europe, okay? Why Kuwait Petroleum Europe? Just because you need to have the raw material, the fuel, to feed the refinery, and therefore you needed to have a guarantee of supply, which was provided by KPE, Kuwait Petroleum Europe. Idemitsu Kosanko Limited, IKC, and Mitsubishi Chemical included as its sponsors to develop, construct, and operate a refinery. So the sponsors are either company with an expertise in refining, or a supplier, which was the case for the Kuwait Petroleum Europe company. So the total investment was $9 billion, okay? And the processing capacity plan was 200,000 barrels of Kuwait crude. So you see, Kuwait was providing the crude oil, 200,000 barrels for the capacity. The refinery is one of Vietnam's key national projects. At that time, it was the early phase, I would say, of this kind of PPP approach. Well, what happened in 2018? I could read, 10 years later, Nhi Son Refinery and Petrochemicals heading for insolvency. What happened? Well, the problem was that PetroVietnam was normally committed to provide a certain amount of capital, okay, as part of its state capital contribution this July. But that's a typical case of countries like yours, where you still have a certain level of bureaucracy with a lack of preparation for this type of project. In the end, when the project is being developed, well, you have this type of difficulties where someone within the, let's say, public bureaucracy would not accept for a payment to take place. That's the typical kind of story. And it is typically what happened for this refinery in 2018, so that, it was really close to the default. But a solution was found at the last moment, and the company could start operation, in December 2018. Okay, but it took a bit of time. About 6 months were lost just because of this type of difficulty, which is a good illustration of the lack of preparation or the, let's say, ambiguity about the objectives or whatever. So that you have discussions within the public entity, between the public participants, which might be a difficulty for, let's say, going further in the project. And finally, in 2020, Vietnam's Nhi Son Oil Refinery offers first gas oil cargo for export. We're exporting because domestic sales have been slow recently, the source said. So you see, here also you can realize that there was another problem, which was probably a wrong estimate of the local sales, so that in the end, an effort had to be made to export abroad. So the commercial risk was probably not assessed quite properly. Okay, so this is just to show what happened in the early phase, with a lack of preparation and lack of expertise. Hopefully things have changed, and I could find a much better case recently, okay, which is a case which is starting. It is the Legan offshore wind farm. It's an ongoing project in Binh Thuan province. Don't show you where it is in Vietnam. I'm pretty sure that you know your country and you know where Binh Thuan is in the southeast coast. Okay. Well, an MOU has been signed with Binh Thuan People's Committee in July 2020. So this is the public entity involved, okay, in the project. So the proposed wind farm will be installed off the coast of Binh Thuan province for a cost which is about $10 billion US, or in euros, 8.6 billion euros. Well, the idea is the partnership behind the project will seek to include the scheme into the power development plan of Vietnam. It's part of the plan for Vietnam. You know, it's clear there to develop new type of power generation, and will then prepare to take final investment decision. Okay, so the first phase is to have a committee that look at the project to make sure that the project will be well prepared and is feasible to take a final decision. Once completed, the plant will be one of the first large-scale offshore wind farms in the Asian countries. So it's a kind of new type of project for Asia, but indeed, this type of project has been developed already in other countries, so that the technology is proven. And remember what I said, you know, you need to have this dimension to make sure that the risk, the technological risk, is not too high. So it means that in the end, rather than this nice horizon like this with a nice sky, then the future should be like this, you know. So would people like it? That's a question that needs to be raised, because we have seen that in Europe. You know, people are not necessarily happy when they had such a nice sky, as you can see it, and then all of a sudden they have this instead. Okay, so that's a problem that will have to be considered in the project development. Okay, so here you have some detail. The potential capacity should be 3.5 gigawatt. Once fully installed, the project is expected to power more than 7 million households per year. Okay, so it's a huge project when you think of it, and avoid 130 million tons of CO2 emissions over its lifetime, which is also something that can be valued, particularly if you can consider that in the future, the price of CO2 would increase, and the saving CO2 means to a certain extent saving money, and that would be counted positively indeed in the project evaluation. So where are we in February 2021? You know, so let's say today. Now the conclusion was positive. You know, it was the first step to build a kind of committee to analyze the feasibility of the project. So Legan Wind Power Development Corporation, okay, has been launched, which is what I call the SPV in my presentation. It will be the project company. So the name of the project company will be Legan Wind Power Development Corporation. Okay, and it is owned. Who are the sponsors? Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, Copenhagen Danish company, okay, with as we'll see, an expertise in the field. Assa Abloy and Novasia. They signed 4 memorandums of understanding on foundations, supply, and harbor services. You see, they mostly intervene in the construction phase. So the MOU were signed with Vietnamese-based contractors, okay, CS Wind Corporation, PTSC Mechanical and Construction, okay, Southern Petroleum Construction, and Vietso Petro. So if you want to describe the project more precisely, using a graph similar to what we have used before. So you start with, at the center, the project company. Its name is Legan Wind Power Development Corporation. You have a public entity which is at the top, which is Bintuan People's Committee. Okay. Who are the developers, or what we call the sponsors? Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, okay, which is a member of CI New Market Funds, which is specialized in funding such projects. Asia Petro, which is a company specialized on the development of large-scale energy projects, including oil and gas, solar, and wind. Okay. And Novasia, which is a specialist in the development of renewable energy, and particularly in wind resources. So you see, the developers are companies with a particular interest in this. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, they are investors specialists in this type of project. And Asia Petro and Novasia are more technical companies, okay, which are with an expertise in the, let's say, technological aspect of the project. So now, indeed, some Vietnam-based contractors will be used, and here you have the list, okay? Also with certain expertise in certain specific fields which are necessary for the development of the project. CS Wind Corporation, mechanical and construction, Southern Petroleum construction, okay? Vietso Petro, as we've seen, LS Vina Cables and Systems from Korea, but also based in Haiphong City, and electrical installation, PECC2, which is also a local company. You know, here with complementary technological skills and expertise to develop the project. What do you have on the other side? If you look at the details, you also have some surveys. You know, you always have in the early phase of the project, at least, some participants which are specialists in providing all type of surveys which are necessary in the early phase of the project development. CPIM, for instance, is a specialist in geophysical, geological, and marine resource investigation. You need to investigate, okay, to see what type of under which type of condition, subsea conditions, you will develop the project for this offshore wind farm. NIRAS is a Danish environmental and social impact assessment. Well, you need to make a social and environmental impact of the project. Remember, I told you that everyone is not always quite happy with the scenery with these wind farms just in front of where they live. Okay, it may have an impact on tourism, a negative impact. Okay, all these things need at least to be taken into account and analyzed precisely to see what type of solution could be brought in to make sure that the negative impact will not be so strong. Okay. What else you have? After that, you will have some other participants providing the technology itself. You know, the contractors we have mentioned before who are mostly involved in the development of the infrastructures and so on, but then you will need to bring the technology itself to produce electricity with General Electric, okay, and Vestas. You know that Vestas is known for providing these wind turbines. The worldwide known specialist in the field. So these two big names are there. It is important to have big names. Why? Because they contribute to reduce the risk of the project. Okay. If you work with General Electric or with Vestas, you are pretty sure that it's not the first time they develop such a project, that they know all the type of difficulties they may have to deal with, okay? And they are ready to take some risk because they are familiar with this risk and they have an expertise to handle them, okay? So it's reassuring for lenders, you know? If GE and Vestas are joining the project, it means that they consider that the project is feasible and acceptable. So indeed, lenders will be reassured by that. Installation and commissioning. So just to give you a full description, here we are. You know, now we have reached a stage in May 2021, okay, as of today, in other words, where most of the participants have been identified. So you have the list and you see already that we have a lot, as I told you, a lot of participants, and it's only part of the picture. It's the simplest part of the picture, because when you look at, for instance, GE, for instance. Of course, they will bring the technology, but they have a lot of sub suppliers, providing some components, some services, and so on, which are not in the picture because they are subcontractors of GE. You also have subcontractors of Vestas. All these companies which are going to participate in the project, they are not on the map here. Okay, but already looking at this, you see the complexity of project finance, which comes from the many participants which have to work together. You have to make sure that there is a good coordination and that all are specialists knowing exactly what they have to do and being able to take the risk, part of the risk of the project, so that in the end, the project company is not too risky for lenders. Well, so that's a good illustration for Vietnam. Okay, it is a project which you can follow up if you like, okay, to see where they are. But I couldn't take this as a reference for the course because, it's still the early phase. You are just starting. So I decided to take, keeping the example of a wind farm, but to take the example of Seapower offshore wind farm, because it's a project that was developed now about 10 years ago, but it is completed so that we know exactly where we are and we have the full story for it. Okay, so very briefly, and we will come to this project later on with some details when we're going to talk about financing. For instance, I'll come back to this project looking at the type of finance which has been used for it. But let me give you a brief explanation. So it's very similar to the wind farm project in Vietnam, but it's located in Belgium. You see, we have the concession area here in a place which we call Santon Sandbank, about 30 kilometers offshore of the Belgium coast. Okay. Seapower is the name of the project company. So I give you all types of details just for your information. I'm not going to comment all this. The water depth where the project takes place. That's why we have a lot of wind farms there, because it's not too deep, 12 to 25 meters. A total capacity of 325 megawatts. Here you have the idea about the annual electricity generation. So it's a smaller project than the one you have in Vietnam right now. You also avoid CO2 emissions. You have wind turbines. The important point to observe here is the fact that it will probably be the case for your Vietnamese project. They will have to define different phases. Why is it so? The phase one is usually a small phase. Why? Because then you prove that the project is feasible, that you have not met difficulties that might, in the end, create such problems that the project wouldn't be viable. So in most projects of that kind, you have a phase which is a kind of preliminary phase. If the project can be developed at this stage, it means that then you have proven that you could go further. Okay? So as you see here, in phase one, you will develop 6 wind turbines only of 5 megawatt each. Once you have done this, well, you will move to phase 2 and 3 with another 48 turbines altogether. Okay, so a small phase to start with, just to verify and to prove that the project is feasible. So the total budget will be here 1,289 million euros, about 1.3 billion. Okay, so the first phase, as I told you, is important. We call it a pilot phase. Okay, for a cost which is only 153 million. So it's about only 12% of the total investment. So it's just, a first amount of money which is spent to see whether it's feasible or not. Okay, it's once you have gone through this first phase that you have proven that you could go further. Okay. So I don't read the details here, but you just have the details if you want. Second and third phases. It has been completed, so the first phase has been completed in September 2008 successfully, and therefore we could move to the second phase. And phase 2 was completed in October 2012, that is 4 years later, with 30 additional wind farms. Okay. And the third and last phase was completed in September 2013. Okay, with the remaining 18 turbines. So now, you know, it's fully completed in 3 steps. Okay, with this type of equipment, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 with all the equipment in phase. So how was the project structured? You know, so we still have this project company in the center, which is called Seapower here. So let's first look at the sponsors. There are many, actually. In yellow, you have the European strategic partners, and particularly the yellow part corresponds to the Belgium shareholders, a company called DEM, which is a worldwide operating maritime engineering specialist. Okay. Part of financial group active, SOCOF is a financial group which is active in the field of energy and transport networks, renewable energy, environment, and water. Okay, so it's a financial company specialized in investing in such projects. You also have SRIW, again, specialist in financing and developing environmental and utility projects. Crashed, which is again an investor. It's an investment vehicle, more precisely, enclosing 99 Belgian municipalities. Okay. In other words, it's a group of municipalities which are working together and contributing to the development of such projects. Okay. Well, these are the Belgian sponsors, but you have other sponsors, meaning investors in the project company as shareholders. You have RWE, which is an energy leader in Germany, a utility. Okay, in other words, a specialist in power generation, as well as EDF, which is the French EDF Énergie Nouvelle. EDF Énergie Nouvelle stands for New Energies. Okay, EDF is a French biggest power company with operations in Europe and North America and in many countries in the world, also a specialist in developing this type of project. Okay, even though most of the capacity of EDF is nuclear energy, but they are also developing actively such type of energy systems. What else? Well, another fund, which is a European fund for energy, climate change, and infrastructure. You know, the Marguerite Fund is funded by a lot of let's say, national financial institutions, which is part of the 2020 European Fund for Energy, as I said. Okay, so these are all the sponsors. As you can see, among the sponsors, you have a lot of investment companies. Okay, in other words, funds which are specialized in the investment of this particular technology, of this particular kind of project. Okay, it's not quite surprising because, you know, a lot of funds are being invested right now in this type of project. A lot of money is available for it, and you have a kind of a growing number of specialists in the field, and they raise a lot of money, and they have to find projects. That's why each time you have a project which is rather consistent, well, most of the big players in investment are coming to join this project, this type of project. Well, so that was for the sponsors, which now you have in the block here. So what else do you have? Now, what about the financing parties? You find here, I'm not going to comment, but all type of banks. These are banks, okay, or financial institutions which are going to provide the so-called non-recourse financing, non-recourse debt, you know, for an amount, as you can see, of 913 million euros. Okay, I remind you that the total amount, the total budget is around 1.3 billion. And you see that the non-recourse financing is about 0.9 billion. So you see something like about 75% of the project. If you count, in addition to this, 10 million euro coming from a EU grant from the European Energy Program for Recovery, okay, altogether, you see you have something like 923 million euros provided for the fund to fund this project company. So you see the equity contribution is lower. If you look precisely, it would be lower than 25%. Okay. So here, this was for the funding. As you can see, a lot of debt. So now you need to have the right to operate, okay? And you need, if you want to develop the project, you need to have enough time to make sure that you will be able to generate cash flows to repay for the debt, okay? Which is usually a long-term debt, okay? So you need to make sure that you will have the right to operate for a period of time which is long enough. That's why you need a concession contract. And this concession has been given by the Belgium state. Well, now, in the first phase, you have construction and engineering partners. I give you a list. You see the many suppliers which have contributed actually to the development of this project. And again, I should say that this is only part of the picture. It is a narrow part of the picture. Because behind each of these companies, you can imagine that you have subcontractors. Okay, so it's much more than just a list of about 10 companies which appear here. What else do you have? Well, you have now on the sales side, okay? You sell electricity to whom? To the Belgian TSO. TSO, which stands, I remind you, if I remember, the transmission system operator. Transmission system operator, which is buying which is, sometimes we call it a grid. That is, it is the entity which is buying the electricity to distribute it to the users, okay? Which is the Belgium TSO, and its name is Elia, okay? So they are committed to buy the electricity, okay, which is provided by Seapower, and they also provide certificates. We'll come back to this later on, but certificates for the saving of CO2 emissions, okay? And these certificates can be sold later on by the company so that it provides the company with an additional income. It's a way to value the CO2 emission saving, which will indeed impact the cash flows through the fact that these certificates, which are given by Elia, can be sold back with a certain value in the market. Okay? And all that is under the control of CREG, which is the Federal Energy Regulator. Well, you also need insurance, indeed, because many things may happen. And there are actually two companies involved. Why? Just because you have two phases, more than two, in fact, but at least two phases, where you have a construction phase, for which you need a construction insurance, which is a very specific type of insurance. And then once the project is completed, then you still have operational risks, things that might occur during the operating phase after completion of the project, and that would be, this insurance service would be provided by Delta Lloyd. Okay, so that is a description, a typical description of a project that took place, and with the different players that were involved in the development of this project, which now exists. Okay. And we'll see later on, we'll get into the detail later on of, let's say, all the financing which have been used here. It's the debt represents more than 70%, okay, of the funds needed to finance the project. So what type of instruments have been used for that? We'll see that later on. Okay, so it was a success story. In 2003, we started with these environmental permits and domain concession are obtained. The first analysis was to see what was the environmental impact, which was from an environmental point of view, was it acceptable? The answer was yes. Okay. Then from 2003 to 2010, building permits are obtained. Okay. And phase one is completed 2007, 2009. And then we could move further for phase two and phase three. Okay. And in the end, phase two include actually the two, 1 and 2 steps after the pilot phase, and the whole thing was completed in June 2013. Okay, so it was a kind of success story, and today the project is doing well. Well, so now the next step. I will assume now that you have roughly understood what project finance is all about, what type of project we are talking about, what type of financing structure we have, the importance of risk analysis. Okay, so now we move after this, let's say, introduction, to let you understand what project finance is, why it is used by governments to develop infrastructure. Let's get into the topic in itself now with cash flow and risk analysis. But I'm just looking at my watch. You know, we have started more than 1.5 hours, so I suggest we have 15 minutes. Would you agree with that? Okay. Comment? T'as fini? Non, j'ai pas fini, je fais un break là. Voilà, musique. Non, pas trop. Je pense pas qu'ils sont. Parce que sinon, c'est la place. Non, ça t'a fait 1 heure de plus. Enfin, ça vous pouvez pas imaginer que t'as raté. Mais quand tu dis, ah, mais je n'avais pas, c'est que je. Oui, t'arrives pas. Je sais que au début, quand on a commencé, j'étais pas allé où il fallait. Et bon, je me dis, qu'est-ce que je fais? Qu'est-ce que je viens encore? En fait, non. De toute façon, tu te poses des questions. Ouais. C'est fatigant. Ah oui, c'est vrai. Oh, je suis en moitié endormie. C'est parce que c'est la pire de ce projet. Non, je le dis. Je me demandais si Igoumenitsa et Igoumen, ça avait la même origine. Igoumenitsa. Et Igoumen? Oui. Dans la source. Ben, je vais te voir. C'est pas un nom d'invente, ça. Quoi? Igoumen. Oui, non, mais c'est le nom du. Tu sais, c'est un prêtre. Un égoumène, c'est un prêtre, je ne sais plus ce qu'il est exactement, mais c'est dans la religion orthodoxe. Et quand je vais voir Igoumenitsa et je demande l'origine phonétique, elle m'en parle. Je me dis tas d'explications sur des tas de trucs. Enfin, tu m'adresses les horaires des ferries, oui, d'accord. C'est quand même éloigné. C'est m'énervé, je ne peux pas commencer mon cours dans les bonnes conditions. Non, oui, tu étais fatigué avant de commencer. Ça t'a fatigué, il fait chaud. C'est quand même au moment de la sieste. Ça. Tu sais ce qui fait ce bouton-là? Il y a Catamaran qui est arrivé là. Heureusement qu'ils sont pas tous. Il faut aller chez nous.
Oui, c'est bien. Non, mais là, tu as mal dans le dos, si c'est sûr.
Je vais mal dans le dos ce soir.
Et pourquoi tu prends pas ça pour changer? Chaise blanche. Non?
37 et 15. 37, c'est pas mal. Moi, j'ai fait que
Ça doit faire toute l'année.
ça va.
Une fois comme ça. Oui, tiens.
parce que je vais voir discuter là. C'est mon plan, on va aller voir se promener là-bas. Ce qu'on pourrait faire, c'est prendre la voiture aussi après. Aller voir sur l'autre côté de la baie s'il n'y a pas un truc sympa pour manger. J'aime bien là, mais enfin, le soir, c'est bien. Alors, si ça passe midi là, on va pas remonter le soir.
Oh, puis midi.
Mais l'autre station, elle est à 10 km.
Non,
J'ai plus de 40. J'en ai plus de 40 parce que 42. C'est pas grave, qu'il soit un.
oui, ça fait du bon.
Ouais. Et au Chili.
Ah, oui, tu fais les deux en même temps.
Je crois qu'il y a des suppléments dessus. Non, mais ça va me faire chier un petit peu. La fois, ils m'ont envoyé le contrat pour que je signe.
C'était un peu énervant au début. Je te posais des questions, mais d'un autre côté, tu sais que tu n'as pas pu tomber sur les gens parce qu'ils t'auraient téléphoné, tu aurais tout de suite vu que tu étais.
Ils sont bourrés sur nous. C'est pas parfait.
Non, non.
Parce qu'au moment où on a décidé, on n'avait pas passé la date de changement de.
Ouais. Alors, ça veut dire que maintenant, tu sais qu'il faut que tu préviennes.
Ouais. J'ai coupé la caméra.
Oui.
Lynn? Can you hear me, Lynn?
Yes, I can hear you. It's
can you see
perfect
me?
now. Yeah, wait me a second.
So it's okay?
Yeah, it's okay
can,
now.
I can shut down because, you know, it takes, it works better if I shut down the video.
Yeah, okay.
Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's start again with. Okay, so let's start again. I've just seen that some of you sent me messages. There was one about COFAS. COFAS stands for Compagnie Française du Commerce Extérieur. Well, it's what we call an ECA agency, Export Credit Agency. And one of their activities is to provide credit insurance. Okay, so by providing credit insurance, well, they improve the quality of the debt of the project. Okay, that's why these type of companies are important. Well, I had also a question concerning what are the main points to finance a project. Let me say that I will be able to answer your question at the end of the course. The course is one of the objectives is to make sure that you would be able to recognize a good project in comparison with another one that shouldn't be good enough to be funded. Okay, so let's start now with the cash flow and risk analysis, which is a key element indeed to start with. Because what you need to do for this long-term project is to have a model that gives you the possibility to assess, to estimate the future cash flows and to which extent they are secured. That's why the risk analysis is important. So let's start with risk issues and risk management. I described to start with, before we move to the cash flow statement, which you are familiar with, let's start with how we can analyze risk. I'm describing here the typical risk management process that takes place when you launch a project, or it could also apply to a company as a whole. You know, companies tend to have their risk management policy now, and they try to put in place all types of procedures and actions to manage their risk. So that's the typical process that is implemented. So first of all, you have to define your objectives. Okay, which when I talk about objective as far as risk management is concerned, the idea is to define your risk appetite. Well, that is the expression which is used. In other words, what is the quantity of risk you are ready to accept? What is acceptable? If in project finance, since you have a lot of debt, the risk appetite is not high because lenders want to make sure they would get their money back. Okay, so since they count on cash flows, the cash flows have to be highly secured because the risk appetite is low in this type of situation because of the high level of debt. So once you have defined your risk appetite or your willingness to take risk, what are the risks you are exposed to? That you need to anticipate, okay? That's risk identification. What are the risks you are exposed to, okay? And once you have identified all the risk, well, you have to process further and evaluate the risk to define priorities, okay? All that, indeed, if the risk is too high and there is not much you can do to mitigate it, well, you can just decide to not to go for it. That is what we call risk avoidance, okay? In this case, you would immediately reject the project, say, no, it's too risky, we are not going to do that. For instance, you know, if you consider investing in a particular country, and if you realize that the political risk is really too high in this country, you may just decide not to go further and postpone the project or decide not to go for it, okay? So once you have done this, you have identified the risk, you know where the most severe risks are, what are the most important things to do, where are the priorities, what can you do? I use the word risk treatment, we could use also risk response or risk mitigation, okay? And there are three ways to do it. Prevention, you can take action to prevent the risk. Prevention means two things, to limit the probability of occurrence of adverse events that would have a negative impact on your cash flows, okay? Or if it occurs, to make sure that the impact will not be too strong, okay? So both reducing the probability of occurrence of an adverse event and also reduce the potential negative impact. That's for prevention. Risk transfer. Well, that's a major element, as I said already, in our analysis. You can transfer the risk outside a project. How to do that? Through contracting. You remember there are many partners, many participants, each being in a good position or in a better position to accept the risk. So the idea is to transfer the risk to those who are in the best position to take it, okay? By doing so, well, you optimize the risk allocation and it will improve indeed the feasibility of the project. Another way is indeed to finance the risk. Insurance is a type of financing, okay? Sometimes we say insurance is a kind of contingent financing in the sense that the insurance policy gives you the right to a compensation in case a certain event occurs, okay? This event being an accident as stipulated in the policy. If it occurred, then you get the money to cover the losses. That's why we use the word contingent financing sometimes, okay? Well, but there are many other financing instruments. Typically, you've heard of derivatives. You know, many projects have concern with the price risk. For instance, if you buy fuel to refine the fuel and produce all type of products, well, you have a volatility of the price of oil. Well, how can you hedge this volatility? Indeed, you can have a specific contract with a supplier, but you can also use hedging instruments such as options, swaps, or forwards and futures. You are familiar with all these derivative instruments, I guess. Okay, these are also part of the tools which can be used to finance the risk. Okay, well, so these are the main tools available to mitigate or to treat the risk. Okay, well, this is something that has to be done to in case the risk occurs. But the day it occurs, well, you have the last step in the risk management process to make sure that you're going to react promptly, and that has to do with crisis management and recovery. Okay, I'm not to be too long on this because crisis management is a topic in itself. Okay, but here I wanted you to have a full picture of what risk management needs. You need to go through all these elements, be ready to cope with a crisis and to recover fast and so on to limit the impact of the losses. Well, and that's indeed is not just this. You need to consider that this is a continuous process. For instance, risk identification is not something you do once upon a time. The project is a living entity. The conditions under which you operate might change. You may have new regulations. You may have new functional conditions, and so on, new technologies, and so on. So that what was analyzed, what was perceived in the past, well, may change today with the new information you have. So this risk identification, risk evaluation, and also risk treatment, all these stages have to be revised continuously to take into account of the changes that might occur and affect the project. Okay, and you have all types of related activities. You need to gather information and analyze information to make sure that you are in line with your projections, making sure that the risk is not deteriorating, monitoring, controlling, and reporting to show the stakeholders that everything is in hand. You also have to communicate to the outside investors, and training indeed if necessary for your people if there are some new technologies to be used or new ways to handle the risk. Okay, so here you have a full picture of what we're talking about when we talk about risk management. Okay, well, so having said that, now identification is indeed, when you develop a project, the very first thing you have to do. Okay, indeed the first step is defining the objective, the risk appetite, but since you have a lot of debt, remember, there is not a big appetite for risk, and the cash flows should be highly secure. So we are not going to talk more about the objectives. Really, the objective is to limit as much as you can the risk for the project company. So what are the risks? How to identify the risk? Well, there is one approach which I proposed here, which is a way to make sure that you will cover all the aspects. And the main problem with risk identification is it's not always easy to identify all risk. And in the end, you have to keep in mind that there are always some risks that exist and which you are not aware of. Okay, so you have to do your best to make sure that the risk you are exposed to without knowing it, make sure that there are not too many of these. So there are three levels of analysis. The first one is at the project level, within the project company itself. You look at all the processes in place, the different technologies which are used, the different entities. It may be different workshops, different facilities, and so on. And you also have networks connecting all these local risk. Okay, this is something that engineers are good at. They can always describe the activity as a system with different entities which are interrelated together. Okay, so for each unit, you have to look at the local risk. It may correspond to a certain technology which is own risk, which are well identified usually. Okay, you may use some materials which might be dangerous. Indeed, you also have the transfer risk, and typically the IT risk is a transfer risk. What if your connection between all the entities is not working anymore? The data cannot circulate and so on, then you are blocked, your activity is blocked, and that's a major problem indeed. That's why the cyber risk is seen today as a major risk. You also have support activities, the relation with customers, marketing activities, finance activities, and so on. Here also, you have some risks which are traditionally well identified. You also have what we call organizational risk. You have different people working together, okay? You have to make sure that they are well coordinated. Accidents occur very often because two actions are taken independently without any coordination. And it may happen that these actions together may not be compatible. And it might be the origin of an accident generating losses, which will, or sometimes the interruption of the activity, which might be very costly for the project. Okay, so I don't need to comment too much on this. And indeed, it will totally depend on the type of projects you are considering, because it totally depends on the type of technology which is used. If you are looking at a hotel project, for instance, you have project finance used to develop big hotels, for instance. Well, the risk of this type of activity, very well known, very well analyzed. So you have all types of models that exist which can be taken. Indeed, if you develop a power plant, it's a totally different story. You have a different technology, you have different types of risk. But again, here, you have some specialists that would help to identify all the risks. So that's at the project level. Now, the project is related to all type of external entities. And let's look as a next step to what I call here the closed environment, okay? The closed environment, well, you will look at all types of partners around the project company. You have the suppliers, indeed. You have the customers, those who are buying what you produce. Well, for the suppliers, you have, for instance, an access risk. For instance, if you have a refinery, you have a pipeline bringing the oil to the refinery. If the pipeline is destroyed because of, let's say, a terrorist attack, why not? Or any type of deterioration, that then the oil is not pouring in the factory anymore. So you have an access problem, and therefore you have an interruption of your activity, which again might cost you a lot. You may have a delivery failure. I mean, your suppliers go bankrupt, or they are themselves, they have an interruption of their activity so that they cannot deliver what you need. Okay, and then again your activity might be interrupted. So you have to imagine all type of things that might occur. Okay, that could create a problem on the supply side. On the other side, you have the customers. Again, you have an access risk. You may not have the possibility to deliver. If there is an interruption, if you have a power plant with an interruption of the connection between your plant and the grid, well, you don't have access to the grid anymore, and you cannot provide the electricity. Okay. When you provide a service or any type of product, you have a product liability risk. Your customers may not be happy with what you have provided to them, or they may suffer. You may be responsible for accidents that occur with your customers, and they will not be happy with that. You may have to pay fine, compensation, and the like. Or your customer may not be able to pay you. You have a solvency risk, and so on. So here on this side, you have to analyze what we call the downside risk, all the risks that relates to the downside part of your activity. Okay. Well, last but not least, in your closed environment, you also have competitors. So competitors, they are dangerous if you operate on a market, if you are exposed to market competition, because if you have any difficulty, well, they will try to take advantage of it. But the main problem with competitors is unfairness. They can try to steal your best people, or to using social media to deteriorate your reputation, and so on and so on. Okay, so again, here there are some specific risks that need to be analyzed. So that again is not. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's usually well known for each area of specialization. Because the typical risks are usually well identified, and there are lists that exist that can be used. And usually, if you work with, as we've seen, if the sponsors are company with a strong experience in the field, they know about all these things, and they have their risk matrix that exist already. Okay, so they may add few elements to the risk analysis because of the particularity of the situation they will have to deal with, but their experience will be very useful to develop their risk analysis. Well, what we need to add here is when it comes to risk control, if you look at the first level, the project level, it is your responsibility. You operate. I mean, those who are running the project company are responsible for the operation. So they have the control of it. So you have a rather high level of control on your risk. Okay. Well, when it comes to the closed environment, well, you still have a certain level of control because you have some contracts with the suppliers and customers, which you can impose some stipulation and so on. But it's a bit trickier because it's outside the company, so you have less control on it. Now, if you move further up to the greater environment, as I call it, well, what do you find there? You find all type of elements which are risk factors for which you have no or very little control. Okay, for instance, you have a legal risk. Why? You may have new regulations that would impose some additional cost to your project. You may have deterioration of financial conditions, so that you might have difficulties, for instance, you may have, for instance, the foreign exchange risk. You know, if your cash flows are in dollars, but your home currency is the euro, well, you may have a volatility of the exchange rates that creates, and you have no control on it. Okay, socioeconomic, you can have strikes in the country where you are. Okay, difficulties with unions and so on. So that's something which is also difficult to control. Political risk is indeed difficult to control also. You also have what we call here natural risk, which comes from, for instance, an earthquake or floods or storms. You know, all these elements which are related to the impact of let's say a natural event has to be considered, particularly today, you know, because of the climate change and all the increase in frequency of storms and the like, you know. And sometimes, you know, it is very important, not sometimes, for certain type of activity, it is very important to look at where you locate your project, okay? The location is now more and more important. What about the risk of a tsunami? Look at the Fukushima in Japan. What about the risk of an earthquake? If you want to develop a nuclear plant in particular, you better make sure that the frequency and the likelihood of an earthquake is not too high. Well, so, you know, natural elements are more and more important. And you have no control on it indeed. You have no control on earthquakes typically. Technological, well, you are developing today a wind farm with a specific kind of turbine, okay? Maybe you will have a breakthrough innovation in the field of energy showing that wind turbines are absolutely obsolescent, and they are not the right solutions. They are expensive, they deteriorate the environment to a certain extent, whereas now there are new solutions with cheaper energy so that your project will be dramatically impacted by maybe the, let's say, emergence of a new breakthrough technology. So this is something also which is difficult to control. And it's a major, indeed, it's a major problem in the energy sector typically, where we can expect that innovation will come with cheaper and cleaner energy. Well, and all that, if you look at it, corresponds to a concept you are probably familiar with, which is PESTEL. You probably have heard of PESTEL already. You remember what it means. PESTEL stands for political, economical, social, technological, environmental, and legal. PESTEL. These are the risk factors. So it's PESTEL, and I have had it, the media. Okay. Well, because the media now has to be considered as a risk factor. You know, the media can create a mess out of nothing for your company. Okay. So it's a major concern, more and more for companies. And to tell the truth, well, there are some difficulties to handle that. So you see, these are all types of factors which are totally out of control for the project, but which have to be considered because some of them are indeed very important on the future of the project. Okay, so once you have done that, if you go through that, okay, with experts who are familiar with the type of activity you develop, well, you should be able to end up with a list of risk, okay, that the company is exposed to, and hence, indeed, the necessity to identify where are the priorities, where are the most important risks, to find solutions to avoid the risk, or to transfer the risk at least out of the project company. What this doesn't show is that you have a timing of risk when it comes to project finance. So the next slide is there to describe the evolution of risk over time. What do you have here? On the vertical axis of this graph, you have the level of uncertainty affecting future cash flows. Don't ask me at this stage how we can measure this, okay? But let's assume you have a kind of indicator of that. So, and you have the time on the horizontal axis in terms of months here. Okay, so you have three phases. At the early stage, at date zero of the project, indeed, you have the maximum level of risk. Why? Because there are lots of uncertainties which will be resolved later on, because time will provide you with more and more information. You have the completion phase. You have the higher level of risk before that. Because the risk, one of the major risks, I will come back to this later on, is during the completion phase, with the risk of having to spend more money than expected, and the risk of having delays and cost overruns. Delays because, well, developing the project is more difficult than you thought, because there are different difficulties that were not anticipated, and so on and so on. So you may have delays, and delays mean more cost, because time is money, as you know, okay? But also cost overrun, because it may appear that developing the project is more expensive than was planned in the first place, okay? So, but at the end, once the project is completed, well, indeed, all these uncertainties will have disappeared. And therefore, the degree of uncertainty of risk is decreasing. Then you have the next phase, which is the startup phase. The project is completed. The equipments are there. They can be used. Yes, but you have to see whether they work as you expect. Maybe the efficiency of the equipment will not be as high as expected. Maybe your wind turbine, which were expected to provide electricity during 40% of the time, maybe the wind is not as much as you thought, that it will be only 35%, okay? So you will realize this during the startup phase, okay? And at the end of startup phase, you will have a full understanding of how your equipment is working and what it can really produce. So when you reach the operating phase, usually a large part of the uncertainty has been resolved and the risk is much lower, okay? So this is important to have in mind. When you look at risk management for a project, you have a timing of it with the maximum risk in the early phase of the project. So the tricky thing from a financial point of view is indeed to go through the tricky phase. The operating phase, is the risk, most of the risk has disappeared. So it's easier to find people to fund. Okay, whereas in the first phase, you have a maximum level of risk, and so a high level of risk. So you will need funds which are very much like equity, and we'll see that. We'll see that we would use what we call mezzanine financing for that. Okay. A last remark before we move to the next slide. When I show you the risk decreasing like this, it means that we know more and more about the future of the project. When you will reach the operating phase, we know how it operates, and we have a good vision about future cash flows. It doesn't mean that the project is successful. You can know for sure that the project will lose money. There is no risk anymore because you're going to lose money. So this doesn't mean that the project is systematically successful. It just means that over time, you know more and more about what the project will provide, okay? So in this phase, the completion risk, delays, cost overrun. The startup phase with the technological risk, you may have the risk is underperformance or premature obsolescence, okay? And the operating phase, you've had all the risk I have mentioned before: supply risk, economic risk due to prices, political risk, environmental risk, financial risk, currency risk, and the like, okay? Well, so let's come back to this concept of timing. So we started with this, the gray curve, which describes the uncertainty resolution which I have presented before. What is the red curve? The red curve is the evolution of the capital employed. You see, the risk is a combination of the uncertainty you are facing and the amount of money you have invested. As long as you have not invested €1, okay, if you have invested nothing, you have no risk. If you have nothing to lose, you have no risk, okay? You start having risk if you have money in the deal, okay? So the red curve here indicates the progression of the capital employed in the project. During the completion phase, you have to invest more and more money to build the projects, to build the facilities, to install the equipment, okay? So you see, it goes up to a maximum, which is the capital employed when the project is completed. And when you start operating, then the capital employed would decrease because of depreciation, okay? Well, so the risk exposure will be a combination of the degree of uncertainty and the amount of money you have invested, okay? Then you have a curve like this to describe the risk exposure. In the first phase, you start from zero. You have no risk because you have not invested yet. As long as you increase your investment, as long as you increase the capital employed in the project, and you see the risk exposure is increasing to reach a peak when you have a maximum capital employed with still a high level of uncertainty, okay? And then it will decrease because of uncertainty resolution as well as the decrease in capital employed. So you see, when it comes to financing, what do you have? To start with, you need equity. Because as you know, equity is a kind of safety net for lenders. There are equity holders. I don't need to insist on that. You have seen that in corporate finance. The raison d'être, as we would say in France, of equity is risk-taking. Equity holders are there to take risk and they bring their equity. And if there is a loss, they will be the first to take the loss, okay? Then, but equity, if you bring only in project finance only 20% or even 30% of the project, equity will not be enough to intervene when the risk is still very high. And you cannot count on traditional lenders to take the risk. So what do you need? You need a kind of intermediate financing. And this is what we are going to call mezzanine financing. Or, you see, mezzanine financing is, we'll see that with more detail later on indeed, but it is sometimes we call it quasi-equity. It is not equity, but it is very much like equity in the sense that, those who are lending at this stage or investing at this stage accept risk. Indeed, if they accept risk, it means they will have a higher return, okay? So they still have a priority on equity holders, but they still take risk as lenders because, the level of risk is still high. But you see, we don't need this type of lenders any longer, when the risk exposure has decreased. So this mezzanine financing is actually a transitory type of financing, okay? Because once you have gone through this risky phase, when you have completed the project, you have gone through the startup phase, then you enter into the operating phase, which is highly secure because we know most about the project. We know that most of the risks are out now. Everything is well under control. So now you can have traditional lenders coming with no recourse debt just because they know that now the project is safe. The high level of risk exposure, investors, the first investors coming in the project have gone through it. Now they can enter the project because the level of risk is now acceptable to them, okay? So mezzanine financing, again, I'm not describing in details what it is, but we're going to see that in the last chapter. I have also added what we call contingent financing here. What is it? When you start a project, you never know how much it's going to cost. For the Vietnamese project, and I don't remember exactly how much it was, but let's say something like 8 billion euros, if I remember well, around this. Well, maybe it will be 8.5, 8.6. So you need to make sure that in case it is a bit more expensive than expected in the first place, that you will find the money you need to go on with the project. Even if it costs 10% more, you have to be ready to cope with that because the project might still be viable even if you have to spend 10% more, okay? Because this might be seen as acceptable. But you need to anticipate that you might need this. So in case you need more, then you can have an agreement with a pool of banks to provide you with more. Equity holders would indeed have to increase also their share, I mean, to maintain the ratio between debt and equity, okay? But this additional financing that would be provided in case it is needed, this is what we call contingent financing. Well, so this is something you should keep in mind, you know, as far as risk is concerned, you know, you have basically two big phases. The early phase with a high risk exposure, which is then resolved, you know, and when you enter in the operating phase, that's when the no recourse debt can come in. So here, I just show you as an illustration, a document from the World Bank. A document from the World Bank, which is the result of a risk analysis and a risk allocation. So the idea is you analyze a risk. This is the first step, risk analysis, to identify the risk and also to assess their size, okay? So usually you put that in a table where you have a category of risk because you like to classify the risk, and you would find in these different categories some that would correspond to the graph we have looked at together with the 3 level, the level of the project, the closed environment, or the greater environment, okay? For each of the risk, you describe the risk, okay? You indicate what type of risk it is, then you describe it precisely. The causes of the risk, why would it happen? How you can mitigate it, and who is responsible for the risk, okay? So, for instance, if you go look at the first line, we're not going to discuss all the line, but just to explain to you how this type of table works. And if you want to know more about it, you find the reference here from the World Bank. So, technical specification risk, you know, you may have a risk at this level. What does it mean? For instance, the possibility that individual technical characteristics of the motorway do not meet standards and specifications. You know, this is a project of toll roads, okay? So then you have a clear description, very precise description of the risk. Why would it happen? Low quality of works, low, it should be a O rather than an A. Obviously, they made a mistake. Low quality of works, non-compliance with construction standards, okay? It may be because of those who have done the job, they didn't do it properly. So you have to make sure that it's typically an internal risk that has to be controlled by those who are in charge of the project itself. Mitigation, independent construction quality control. Okay, make sure that those who are doing the control are not those who are doing the job, because they may not be quite transparent about it. Development of penalty deduction mechanisms to include in the agreement with contractors. Okay, so in this case, you transfer part of the risk to the contractors, okay, by imposing them penalty if there are some problems at this level. That's the way you can mitigate the risk, by transferring the risk to the contractors, indicating that, you know, they would have penalty if there is a problem on that side. And you are indeed in charge of this risk. I mean, the concessionaire, who is the project company. So completion risk, let's go for the next one. The possibility that the completion of construction works may be delayed. Difficulties with rearrangement of utilities, complication due to geological and hydrological conditions. When you start such an infrastructure, you never know exactly what you're going to find in the ground. See also right-of-way risk and regulatory risk, okay? So you see, for all these reasons, you may have a delay. Well, the mitigation, estimation of losses that may be incurred in case of delayed introduction of the motorway, penalty deduction, as we say. Who is responsible? Either the concessionaire, the project company, if the delays cannot be attributed to the grantor. Maybe the delays are attributed, for instance, for the state entity which is behind the project. In this case, well, you wouldn't have, the project company would not be exposed to the risk, and so on and so on. So I'm not going to read all the risk, but you can have a look at it. You have different, you have, all these risks which are well described, the causes of the risk are indicated, and how they can be mitigated. That's a typical table, okay? So, once you have done this, we need to predict the future cash flows, okay? So, now, let's come to the cash flows themselves, and we'll come to bring in the risk again in a minute. So this is a simplified version, indeed, of a cash flow statement. And again, I'm assuming that you are familiar with this because you saw that in accounting and in corporate finance. So for the sake of simplicity, you see, I just write that the sales corresponds to quantities which are sold times the price. If it's a power plant, for instance, it would be the quantity of electricity times the price. That would give you the sales. Or for a refinery, it would be the quantity of refined product sold times the unit price. Then you have the sales. The costs, the main costs are purchases indeed, and all other operating costs that would include payroll expenses and the like. And then you obtain the EBITDA, earning before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. You are familiar with that. Then you take out depreciation and you find the EBIT, earning before interest and taxes. Well, then you take taxes out, okay? You obtain the NOPAT, net operating profit after tax. I don't want to insist in that because you are normally familiar with that. You remember in corporate finance when you have discussed the investment decisions, and when you look at the valuation of an investment, we look at the project independently of how it is financed, okay? The cost of funds will be taken into account through discounting. So, in other words, since you are taken into account the cost of funds through discounting, the cost of funds should not be in the cash flow analysis. Okay, you look at it from a pure operational view without any consideration of the cost of funding the project. That's why here, after the EBIT, we are not taking out the cost of funds, interest payments typically, okay? But we just look at the taxes. We look at the taxes that would be generated by the EBIT. When you take out the taxes, you have the so-called, which you are familiar with, I guess, the NOPAT, net operating profit after tax. So what about the cash flow? You know, you are familiar with that. You now have to add again the depreciation because depreciation is not cash out. You have to also to take out the change in working capital, because if you increase your working capital, then it's a kind of cash consumption. I don't insist on that. I'm assuming you know. And then you will find the operating cash flows. Out of the operating cash flow, you will take the investment expenditures, which provide you with usually what we call the free cash flow. But here I'm not referring to this expression, free cash flow. I'm using an expression for the same type of item, but I call it the cash flow available for debt service. Why? Because this type of cash flow statement is mostly designed for the lenders, to provide lenders with financial information about the project. What they want to know is the cash flow that is generated by the project that will be available to repay the debt service. Okay? That's why we call, rather than the free cash flow that would be after that allocated to the different partners, we give a kind of priority to the lenders because they have a no-recourse debt. Remember, particularly those with a no-recourse debt. Since they have a no-recourse debt, it means they count mostly on cash flows to get their money back. And that's why they will have a priority on the cash flows, okay? So rather than the word free cash flow, we use the concept of cash flow available for debt service. Then you take out the debt service, and the bottom line is the cash flow to equity, what remains for equity holders, okay? So this is a typical cash flow statement. Indeed, in real life, you mean something much more complex because you need to have all the details about operating expenses, all the detail about purchases, all the details about the quantity sold. You know, you may have different type of items, different prices, and so on. So now the problem is the timing. This is a cash flow statement, and if you look at it, if you want to predict for the future, you will have different column, one column for each year. Okay, how many years are you going to consider? Okay, and what are the most important dates in the project development? So let's look at this timing. You have a first phase, which is the preparation phase. Economic analysis, risk analysis, and funding. What is a project? What are the economic fundamentals of the project? What are the main risks and how can we fund it? Okay. Then you start, the starting date really is what we call the COD, commercial operation date, or a signature of the agreement with, for instance, if it's a PPP with a public entity. Okay. Then you have the completion phase. You start spending money. Okay. You have developed all type of agreements with the banks. Okay. You have indeed, during the preparation phase, you have to spend a bit of money because there are some surveys and so on which need to be included. But usually you have this spending which are done before we start evaluating the project. Okay, because this preparatory phase, okay, will provide you with all the data you need to build the cash flow statement. Okay, then you will consider the completion phase after the commercial operation date, when you sign with the different partners, with the banks, with the public entities, and with the major sponsors. You have the completion phase, okay? And then you have the operating phase. Well, what is the end of the operating phase? The first concept which we will introduce is what we call the useful life of the project. During how many years can you really operate the project? If it's a wind farm, well, it's very difficult to know how long you can use a wind turbine. But traditionally, for most projects, people will consider 20 years. You might ask me why 20 years. My answer would be why not? Okay. Well, it seems that specialists, experts, well, who have a say, they would consider that 20 years is a reasonable guess. So when you look at the future, never forget that you are looking for the best guess. You never know for sure. Okay. So operating phase, the useful life of the project. And you also have another important date, which is the term of the debt. Indeed, you have to make sure that the term of the debt occurs before the useful life of the project. You cannot imagine a debt that would go further than the useful life of the project. Okay? So this is very important because you need to be very specific for the analysis of cash flows up to the term of the debt, because that is what the lenders are concerned with. That's why this date is important. It is not the final life of the project, but it is an important date because that is the date that lenders, will consider. Because after this date, there is no debt service anymore. Okay, so lenders who are most concerned and who are going to the most important people to consider in the analysis, okay, they are concerned with this horizon. Okay. Another date which is important is the term of the agreement. The term of the agreement, for instance, if you have a BOT, which is a build, operate, transfer, okay, which means that the project company will be in charge of building the facilities, the infrastructure, to operate it, let's say during 20 years, okay? And maybe the useful life of the project will be 30 years, okay? In other words, after 20 years, you transfer the facilities, all the remaining assets, you transfer the infrastructure to the state becoming the owner of the infrastructure. Okay, but if there is a residual value, it's fair enough to say, well, that this residual value should be paid to the sponsors because they have built the value. So it means that if you transfer to the state, well, the state has to pay for the value of what we made. Okay, and this is part of the things that have to be negotiated indeed. And the residual value will have an importance on the decision of the sponsors whether they decide to get into the project or not to get into the project. Okay? So you have this, let's say, I would say 3 important dates: useful life of the project, which have to be long enough, okay, to make sure that the company will be running until the end of the term, until the term of the debt. And you have the term of the agreement, okay, which can occur before the end of the project itself, okay? And then you have this residual value issue. You can have another date to be considered, which might be anywhere, which is the early termination. Early termination might occur, for instance, if you have a default by the project company. Why would the project company default? Maybe because after some years, they will realize that the completion of the project will be much more expensive than expected. That maybe it may be difficult to work. There is a kind of disagreement between the public authority and the private sponsors, and they just realize that they will not be able to work together, okay? And therefore, the sponsors might decide to withdraw from the company, or the authority might decide to put an end to the project, okay? Force majeure, it's any type of event that would interrupt the project, which is under the control of no one. Don't ask me to give you an example, because I've never clearly understood what force majeure was. Because when you say, well, this is a force majeure, you always find a lawyer telling you, no, it's not exactly a force majeure, because it's not fully independent of your action, and it's not fully out of control. So it's very difficult to define precisely what a force majeure is. Okay, it might be optional. Okay, it might be part of the rule of the game. If we just realize that at a point in time that certain conditions are not met, then automatically you have an interruption of the project. And indeed, lenders are most concerned with the condition of early termination. What occurs if? Why? Because the lenders are concerned because they want to see what type of value would be available to repay them if they have already invested some money in the project. Okay, so even if you cannot stipulate a very precise date because we never know when it occurs, lenders want to know how it happened if an early termination occurs. Okay, so here are the main important dates to have in mind. Okay, so now we have the project cash flow. And if we now look at risk again, you see that for each line, what is most important for lenders in particular, the cash flow available for debt service, and also the cash flow to equity, which concerns the sponsors. Well, you know that these elements of the bottom line, the CAFDS or the cash flow to equity, are uncertain because, you know, all of the elements above are more or less uncertain. If you look at the quantities sold, well, it depends on the market demand, okay? Which is volatile. So you never know exactly how much you're going to sell. The price, you have some ideas about it, okay? But again, it depends on market demand. You may have a price control. The governments might intervene and decide to fix prices and so on. If the price is expressed in terms of foreign currency, well, you never know what will be the foreign exchange rate. You have currency risk. Okay, so the sales are uncertain. What about purchases? You may have a supply failure. You may have price volatility of what you buy. You may have import restrictions that creates difficulties also. Okay, so you have here risk factors. For each line, you can identify some risk factors. What about operating costs? You may have cost overruns because of inflation, because of organizational inefficiency. Okay, so that your costs are higher than expected. Okay, depreciation will depend on how much you have invested, so it depends on the investment cost. Taxes, you can have a change in tax regulation. Okay, change in working capital, it may be you may have operating delays, increase in inventory and receivables, so that your working capital is higher than expected. Investment expenditures, as we mentioned already, you can have cost overrun and delays. CAFDS, cash flow available for debt service. Even if the cash flow is there, it may not be available for lenders. Okay, why? Because maybe you have some difficulties to transfer the money out of the country. And it's the same for the cash flow to equity. And as to the debt service, you may have a currency risk if your debt is in a foreign currency, or you may have interest movements, and some of the debt might be with a variable interest rates. So you see, you have all types of sources of risk, which can be now injected. All the risk which you have identified in the first place, as you can see here, they would impact one line or another of this cash flow statement. Okay, so what is the next step? You have identified all the sources of risk or the risk factors. Now you can try to see how you can allocate the risk. This is typically what you find in the table we have commented before from the World Bank. You see, you have types of solutions. For instance, for the quantities sold, you can have a sales agreement, what you call an offtake contract. We'll see what it is later on with more detail. For the price, you have sales agreement also that can kind of stabilize the price. Okay, or you can use hedging with swaps and or options or forwards and futures. Okay, purchases, you can have supply agreement and hedging again. Other operating costs, you can have operating agreement with some suppliers or some the companies in charge of the operations, and you can transfer the risk to these operators in case there are cost overruns. Okay. Taxes, well, that's typically a political risk if there are changes in tax regulation, and that can be covered by a political risk insurance. Change in working capital can be part of the operating agreement also, which you have with external players. Investment expenditures, you can deal with this cost overrun and delays through the construction contracts that we've seen. You can also use insurance. For the non-availability of lenders, it can be included in the loan contract to exclude this type of risk, or you can use, remember, the so-called concept of escrow account. Foreign currency would be located outside the country. For instance, for Vietnam, it would be in Singapore, to make sure that the money would remain available and can be transferred easily to cover the debt service outside of Vietnam. Okay? And the debt service, indeed, you can use hedging if you have volatility of interest rate risk or currency risk. An insurance for cash flow to equity, insurance because it can be a solution if the non-availability of the money for sponsors is due to political issues. So you always find, the idea is once you have a risk factor, a source of risk, you try to find the way to handle it, okay? To mitigate it, to make sure that in the end, the final risk for the cash flow available for that service or for the cash flow to equity, that the final risk will be reasonable and acceptable by those who are bringing the money, okay? So once you have done this, companies would usually try to, I'm sorry, maybe you hear a bell ringing because I hope it doesn't disturb you too much. I hope it won't last too long. So anyway, we're going to look at the next slide, which is a kind of document which is used by most companies and for most projects to describe the risk exposure of a company. I'm just asking someone to close the window. Here's better, I think. Okay, so this is what we call the risk matrix, which can be built for a project. And this risk matrix is very much used. That's why I'm presenting it here. You have two axes, indeed. The horizontal axis, you show the severity of consequences. Okay, it can be moderate, serious, or disastrous. Okay, and you have the likelihood, the probability of occurrence. In other words, you are looking at a risk as an event that can produce a negative impact. So you measure the severity of consequences, and this event has a certain probability of occurrence, which you also measure on the vertical axis. So one risk would be somewhere on the map. If it's on the green area, it would be considered as acceptable usually, because its impact is moderate or not too strong, or if it is strong, it is so unlikely that you can accept that the idea that, well, it will not occur. You know it may occur, but it's so unlikely that anyway you accept the idea that you have to take risk a bit in life, and that's it remains acceptable. Indeed, nobody would like to take a risk position in the red area, because it would be a risk potentially disastrous with a high probability. So indeed, this is not a place where you want to be. That's why we call this level 1 risk first priority. If you have a project risk which is there, you need to take action to move it down, to an area where it becomes tolerable. Okay, in the yellow area, it might be tolerable. Okay, if ALARP, what does it mean? ALARP, it stands for as low as reasonably practicable, which means that there is a limit to what you can do to reduce, to mitigate a risk. And to go further in the risk reduction, you would have to spend so much money that it becomes unacceptable. Okay. But you know, when it comes to project finance with a huge level of debt, no need to say that when you reach the operational phase, and when you reach a situation where lenders will come with no recourse debt, well, it's better to be in the green area, okay? The yellow area will still be acceptable for mezzanine financing, when you are at a level where risk is rather high, but still tolerable, okay? If you have risks which are in the red level, forget it, okay? Nobody would like equity holders as well as even the first lenders, they will not accept to come. So you need to be at least in the first phase in the yellow area. Okay. Then when you move to the last phase of the project, once it is completed, once most of the risk has been resolved, then you need to be in the green area, and therefore no recourse debt will become acceptable. Okay, well, this matrix, I show it to you because it's very often used. Okay. But I just make some comments here. You have to be careful with that. Okay. Actually, there are only 2 axes. Why? Because consultants are comfortable with 2 axes. It's easier to use because you can show that on a map, you know. And it's whereas if you had the other axis, they may not like it because it's much more difficult to show a clear document. Okay, but you know, you could imagine more than 2 axes. For instance, you could have a dimension which is the controllability of the risk. It is important to know if a risk is under your control or not. If it is under your control, it means that you can take action, okay? And you feel more comfortable with that. Well, it depends whether it's a long-term risk, such as obsolescence, for instance. You know that obsolescence will not be an immediate risk. It may occur, but later on. So if you say later on, it means that you will have time to react, okay? It's not the same as a risk that can occur at any time. Okay, this is also a dimension that should appear if you want to describe properly, if you want to have a full description of the risk. But with these 2 axes, you know, it doesn't show that. So you see, it's a limited approach, which is very much used, but as I said, not always quite relevant. Another thing is, okay, it's nice to have such a map, but what about the reliability of the information you get? When it comes to likelihood, for instance, what is the likelihood of a delay of more than 2 years? Who can say, well, an expert might always tell you, well, you know, I think the probability is 10%. What does it mean? It's totally subjective, okay? So you have to be very careful with that, okay? Because we know by experience that there is what we call an assessment bias systematically, with those who are in charge usually a bit too confident, particularly the engineers. They are very much confident in their capacity to control things, okay? And they underestimate the probability of, let's say, difficulties, which results in delays and cost overrun, which is an explanation, by the way, for delays and cost overrun, because people tend to be, engineers sometimes are too confident in their capacity to do things. Well, also one problem is that you identify all the risk as being independent. You know, you have a kind of all type of risk which are positioned in this matrix, but you know, normally you should have a portfolio approach. You know, you may have several risks which are, let's say, the green area. They might be extremely unlikely, okay, but they would have a major impact. Okay, it's green. But you know, the problem, if you have one of these risks, it's okay, you can survive with it, you can handle it. But what if you have several of these? What if there is a kind of correlation effect? Meaning that when a risk occurs, usually it may have an impact on other things with other risks occurring, okay? A kind of contamination impact, okay? Well, this map doesn't show this because it doesn't take into account the possible negative correlations. And also, you know, I don't like this thing here because it seems to be acceptable with this yellow color here. Well, it is so unlikely that people tend to forget it, which will never happen. Well, but don't forget, okay? And you know, if potentially a risk is identified, can be disastrous, well, you have to make sure that everything has been done to control it. Well, so I wanted you to see that because if you, probably some of you have already seen that in your company, because it is not only used for project, it is used for describing the risk a company is exposed to, okay? Company with a risk management process, usually they have this type of metrics to put in a report where they describe their risk for all the stakeholders, okay? It's part now of what we call the governance issue. Your company have to show their risk, okay? It's part of the type of communication they have to provide to the stakeholders, okay? So in the end, one of the major criticism of this matrix, it's a risk mapping tool, which is very much used, but you know, it's more for formal reporting rather than really managing risk. So it's always the same problem, you know, it's a kind of bureaucratic approach to risk management. You want to describe the risk you are exposed to, so just you have a nice map here, but this map may not be quite useful in terms of risk management, okay? And there is one consensus among risk managers, okay, that forget about probability. If a risk is severe, whatever the probability, anyway, you can't assess it with a strong reliability, okay? The severity of consequences come first. If consequences of a particular event are potentially very severe, well, you have to find a solution, whatever the likelihood, okay? Well, so now this was for the risk analysis, how to identify the risk, what are the causes, how it can be mitigated, okay? Now, there are a few things you need to know on how we measure risk. You have seen in finance that very commonly we use the standard deviation, but I will show you that there are other measures which are used. Probably some of you are already familiar, for instance, with the concept of value at risk, okay? So the next step will be or focus on risk metrics with the use of probabilities. We'll see to which extent it is possible to use this. And I want to say a few words about simulation tools, because simulation tools are more and more used to analyze the risk of projects. And now it is easy to use because you have a lot of easy to use softwares which are available. And then I will look at these concepts of value and earning at risk, which are now also quite common in project finance analysis. Okay, but I'm just looking at my watch. It seems now it's time to stop. So see you tomorrow. Okay, see you tomorrow. It will be 3 p.m. for me in France, and I don't really know what time it will be in Vietnam, probably 7 p.m. Okay. See you tomorrow at 3 p.m. French time. 7 p.m. for you, I guess. Okay. I don't know if you bye bye.